In 1967, the so-called Summer of Love had arrived, bringing with it psychedelic music, no doubt because of all the psychedelic drugs everyone was doing. Now, artists like Jefferson Airplane, Pink Floyd, The Byrds, The Grateful Dead, and Jimi Hendrix were playing around with psychedelia in their music, while the Beatles released Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, often seen as the peak of psychedelia. The Rolling Stones wanted in too. Their pop sound from the mid-60s had evolved into something more experimental and rich. Brian Jones's experimental instrumentation added real depth to songs like Ruby Tuesday, and this progression led to their 1967 album, Their Satanic Majesties Request, which marked their full dive into psychedelia. While this album didn't provide many solid hits for the Rolling Stones, it did keep the band up to date and with the times. You see, they didn't want to be seen as falling behind as the generation's musical tastes were evolving. And as the 1967 idealism of the peace movement faded and the political climate of 1968 grew darker, the music began to change as well to reflect this. And in the early months of 1968, the Rolling Stones found themselves wondering what the bloody hell to do next. Their last #1 single, Paint It Black, had been released in May 1966, almost 4 years ago. Were they running out of steam? After the departure of their manager and producer, Andrew Loog Oldham, the band had produced Their Satanic Majesty's Request on their own, but they found this process distracting. To move forward, they turned to a man named Jimmy Miller. He had worked with the Spencer Davis Group and Traffic. Jagger and Richards were mighty impressed by his work, so they approached him, asking him to work on their next album. And Miller made it clear from the beginning he didn't want his DNA all over the album. Instead, he wanted to capture the Stones as, well, the Stones. So they stripped back their sound. They simplified. They were sort of returning to the blues, reconnecting with the music that initially inspired them as a band, while also experimenting with some new directions with Miller. Keith Richards later said, "Suddenly between us, this whole new idea started to blossom, this new second wind, and it just became more and more fun." Now, the Rolling Stones were scheduled to rehearse at R.G. Jones' studio in Morden, Surrey, one evening. Brian Jones, Bill Wyman, and Charlie Watts arrived promptly and on time. Keith and Mick didn't. They were running late. And to kill time, the three Stones that were there started jamming. Bill started playing a distinctive new riff on the piano with Charlie and Brian following his lead. It sounded really good and tough, Wyman recalled. When Mick and Keith eventually walked in, they immediately recognised the riff's potential. "Keep playing that and don't forget it, it sounds great," Keith said. And that riff stayed with Keith. Not long after, he was at his country cottage in Redlands, West Sussex. He and Mick were hanging out, jamming, trying to write some tunes, probably taking loads and loads of drugs, and eventually Mick fell asleep. Shortly after, the sound of heavy rubber boots woke him up. "It was my gardener, Jack Dyer, a real countryman from Sussex," Keith later explained. "It woke Mick up. He asked, 'What's that?' I said, 'Oh, that's Jack. That's Jumpin' Jack.'" Keith then began to play around with the phrase on his guitar, which was tuned in open tuning. Mick, half awake, added flash. And just like that, they had a catchy rhythm and phrase to build on. And from there, they wrote the song, Jumpin Jack Flash. It began at Olympic Sound Studios in Barnes with Jimmy Miller producing. It was recorded in the most peculiar way, Mick Jagger later said. "We recorded Keith and Charlie Watts on a cassette, then put the cassette on a multitrack to get the distortion. And Keith Richards found a new sound while experimenting with an acoustic guitar. He found that when he overloaded a Philips cassette player to the point of distortion, when he played it back, it mimicked the sound of an electric guitar. The cassette player acted as both a pickup and an amplifier. In the studio, Keith connected the cassette player to a small extension speaker and placed a microphone in front of it to add depth to the sound. And the rest of the band thought Keith was mad, but Keith knew he was onto something, and Jimmy Miller saw this as well. He layered his guitars for the track, using open E tuning with a capo for the first and Nashville tuning for the second. As I've said many times on this channel before, I am not a guitar person, I have no idea what any of that means. Hopefully it means something to you. Keith also helped out on the drums for this track. Keith is playing my floor tom-tom to create the boom-da-boom-da sound. Charlie once explained. Keith then later overdubbed the bass, while Bill Wyman contributed on the organ and Brian Jones added his guitar. The sound on Jumpin Jack Flash is very close together, Charlie continued, because we all sit close to each other in the studio. And hopefully you all agree there's a proper raw energy about Jumpin Jack Flash, and it matched Mick Jagger's new persona. He took on the character of Jumpin Jack Flash, someone who was strong, untouchable, unstoppable. And Jumpin Jack Flash was a departure for the Rolling Stones from their recent psychedelic past. It's about having a hard time and getting out, Jagger once explained. Just a metaphor for getting out of all the acid things. And if you really think about it, Jumpin Jack Flash was a product of the time. I mean, there was so much unrest and uncertainty in the world at that point in the late 60s. The overall feeling became less hippie and more, well, politically unstable. There was nothing about love, peace and flowers in Jumpin Jack Flash, Jagger said. On May 12, 1968, 2 weeks before Jumpin Jack Flash was released as a single, the Rolling Stones previewed the song at the NME Poll Winners concert at the Empire Pool in Wembley. This was Brian Jones's final performance with the band. Now keep in mind, a full year had passed since the Rolling Stones performed live, and on that day they only performed 2 songs, Jumpin Jack Flash and Satisfaction. The reaction to their new song was everything they had hoped for. You could feel the Empire Pool shaking to its foundations as the roar went up, said Nick Logan of the NME. It was just like old times. In fact, it was better than old times, he said. The single was released on May 24th and it quickly shot to the top of the UK charts, marking a triumphant return for the Rolling Stones, as they embraced the hard-edged sound that had driven their success in earlier years. It really was the Stones at their peak. And accompanying the single were 2 promotional videos, both directed by Michael Lindsay Hogg, shot at Olympic Studios. The 2 Jumpin Jack Flash videos are each distinctive in their own way. The first video presents a completely unique version of the song with different vocal and instrumental arrangements. The second, more commonly seen version, features the band in elaborate makeup and includes Mick Jagger recording a fresh vocal take over the original backing track of the single. The shoot began with the version without makeup, and while the band's performance was strong, something felt missing, though it wasn't immediately clear what it was. During a lunch break, Brian Jones wandered over to the makeup counter and started experimenting, putting on makeup, wiping it off, trying different colours, just seeing what he could do. And Michael Lindsay Hogg had an idea. He told Mick, Keith, Charlie and Bill to also try out the makeup themselves. They were encouraged to experiment with whatever appealed to them, whether it be stripes, eye makeup, or even full-face glitter. With the help of the skilled makeup artist, Linda DeVetta, they became fully engaged in the process. After about an hour, their appearances had transformed, especially for Keith and Brian. The final touch came when large space-age glasses were found, adding a new level of eccentricity to the look. And in both videos, you can see Jagger fully embracing his dark, rebellious persona, capturing the character of the song perfectly. However, it wasn't all positivity, because these music videos for Jumpin Jack Flash had a lasting consequence for the Rolling Stones. See, they managed to rack up a bill of around £2,450 for the music videos, but they were struggling to pay it, and they were unsure why. So they hired some solicitors to review their finances. This led to the discovery of their dire financial situation under Alan Klein's management. The Stones alleged that their manager, Alan Klein, had withheld royalty payments, stole the publishing rights to their songs, and neglected to pay their taxes for 5 years. And this ultimately led to the band leaving the UK as tax exiles in 1971. Despite the band's financial turmoil, Jumpin Jack Flash marked the end of the Stones' unlucky streak with singles, soaring to the top of the charts in the UK, US, Australia, Germany, and the Netherlands. Protests and strikes brought Paris to a standstill in May and June of 1968, and the song became the soundtrack, being played through open windows above the demonstrations. For the Stones, this new song marked a new era for the band. Now they were all about this raw, primal energy. And Jumpin Jack Flash remains one of the most covered songs in rock history, with versions by artists like Aretha Franklin, Motorhead, and Peter Frampton. However, none have surpassed the original, which remains one of the most electrifying, provocative, and influential singles of all time. Really though, the song is its strongest when the Stones are performing it live. Jagger exudes this visceral energy, even in old age, that you just can't help but be sucked in by. So no wonder they've played the tune live more than 1,000 times since its release. It was even played at their infamous Altamont free concert show. Now, this was a show that ended in disaster. For something that was supposed to be about peace and love, it ended in chaos and murder. I've made an entire video about this event. Click over there, watch it next.